Recently, in Canadian Woodworking and Home Improvement magazine, Vic Teslin and I wrote an article about making a side table that had tapered legs. Now, we ended up talking about making this jig that you see here, and I wanted to shoot this video to show you exactly how that's done and how it's actually used. So, you can go to the store and buy a tapering jig, and you'll probably end up with something like this. You can tell I don't like this because most of the parts are still in the bag. The reason I don't like it is because I don't think it's very safe in that the makers of this jig are counting on the force of the blade holding your leg stock against this L bracket. Now you can lock the taper in. I haven't totally assembled this. This side would ride against the fence, this side with your leg stock against the blade. So when you're doing that, like I said, there's no way to hold this safely. So instead, I came up with the shop-made jig that's really quite simple to make. It's a piece of MDF, 3 pieces of hardwood, and these Bessie auto-adjust toggle clamps. So let's get started. In order to make the jig, I've milled up a sample piece of the legs. It's 26 inches long by 1.25 inches square, and I've also drawn the taper that I'm going to need. At the top it's going to be the full 1.25 inch square, and at the bottom we're going to leave 3/4 inch. Now when it comes to the actual legs, what I do is I use the cabinet maker's triangle to let me know what's the inside and outside faces. So these are just some small 4 scrap pieces, the cut off from the sample leg. And I've drawn the mark on the top. That also lets me know what's the top and what's the bottom. I also go the extra distance and mark the outside faces with a pencil mark. That way I know what's going to be riding against the blade and what's going to be against the jig and not be cut. As far as the jig goes, the base, I've raised it using these scrap pieces of wood, and the length is going to be approximately 2 inches longer than the actual leg, and the width consideration is just so that it's wider than the clamp. That way it doesn't hit the fence as you're using it. So in order to make the jig, I'm going to take the sample leg and clamp it in position as if I was going to actually cut it. So I'll use a couple of clamps. Start off lightly. Make sure everything's in position and adjust accordingly. Now I'll tighten down the clamps. And then I'm going to use some square blocks to mark the position of the legs. So I'll use brad nails to lock it in position from the top, and then countersink and put screws in from the bottom. When I'm driving the brads in, I kind of angle it slightly so that it pushes against the leg. That way everything's nice and tight. One other thing that I'm going to do is I've got a small piece that I'm going to mark the end with. So I square this up slightly inside the full width of the jig, and again tack this in place with a couple of brads. So the next step is going to be removing the clamps and flipping it over, and now drive some screws in to make sure that those blocks don't move. As you can see, I've roughly drawn out where those blocks are on the other side, and now all I'm going to do is pilot hole and countersink and drive a couple of screws in for each block. So the next step is to put the leg back onto the jig and start positioning our clamps. We don't want the blade to hit the clamps, so we're going to move them back and forth so that we've got some clearance, but we also have as much as the pad holding on to the leg. And once that's done, just like the previous blocks, we'll hold them in position with a few brads and then screw them in from underneath. I've secured the block from the underside with a couple of screws, and I've also drilled some pilot holes, and now I'm just going to attach the clamp to the block. Now it's just a matter of adjusting the mechanism so that it clamps the leg. The last step in securing the leg to the jig is drilling a pilot hole and inserting a screw with just the tip protruding through. Now that the jig is complete, we just take our leg, clamp it in position, and head over to the bandsaw. To cut the taper, move to the bandsaw and set up the fence so that it just rides along this edge. Turn it on and cut your first taper. To cut the second taper, unclamp the leg, flip it over, clamp it back up, and we're back at the bandsaw. Now that the tapers are cut on the two outside faces of this leg, it's time to move on to the other three.